Hi, I'm Bill Hallman. Thanks for watching Conversations Live Parenting. You could make the case that kids in the United States are safer now than at any point in modern history. Child mortality rates have fallen by nearly half since 1990. According to the FBI, reports of missing children dropped 40% between 1997 and 2014. Even the most common cause of accidental death among children younger than 13, motor vehicle crashes, has dropped 76% since 1975. But if you're a parent, none of the stats that I just rattled off are going to make you sleep any better at night. Being a parent is hard work. It's stressful. You constantly worry about your child's safety, health, and happiness. And that's why we're here tonight. We want to have a conversation about parenting and children. And if you don't hear the answer you're looking for, we want to let you know where to turn for good advice. So let's introduce you to our guests. Dr. Kristen Buss. Dr. Buss is a professor of psychology and human development and family studies at Penn State. She's a developmental psychologist who specializes in infant and child emotional development, temperament, and anxiety development. She's the director of the PACT Center in Harrisburg, which supports community-university partnerships in research on children and families. And Dr. Karen Bierman. She is also a professor of psychology and human development and family studies. She's also the director of the Child Study Center at Penn State. Her research focuses on child social emotional development. She also helps develop and evaluate school and community-based prevention programs. And you can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet your questions using the hashtag WPSUconversations. I want to begin by thanking you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It's nice to be here.
No problem. I mentioned that parenting is pretty stressful, and as a father, I think a lot of that stress comes from an overload of information. There are blog posts, there are books. It seems like everybody on social media has parenting advice for me, and I don't know if any of that's good advice or not. I want to begin the conversation by telling people where they can turn for trusted advice. And Karen, I'll start with you. What do parents need to know when they're looking for reliable information about parenting?
Yeah, you're right about the overload. There's just information everywhere. And so generally, the thing to look for is who's the information coming from? What's the source behind it? And what's the basis for the opinion that's being shared? Generally speaking, when you go to a website that has a .gov or a .edu, you're getting something that's going to be more research-based. It's going to have more backing to it. Those tend to be a little bit more trustworthy, but definitely you want to look at who is the person who's giving advice and what's their credentials.
And Kristen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would add that, and a lot of times, parents want to go to the advice that sounds like what they would do, right? It's appealing to hear what you think you should be doing, but I often also tell parents to sort of trust your gut a lot of times. It is hard. There is a lot of information out there. Most of the problems and most of the stress in parenting is the everyday stuff. It's really not the big stuff. When it comes to the big stuff, then the advice about going to those trusted sites, and including going to your pediatrician, teachers, people who you know and trust.
And on that same topic, moving along past the books and the blogs and the trusted sites, when does a parenting issue rise to the level of seeking out professional advice? When should you consult a professional about an issue?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really kind of depends on what your concerns might be. But if we're talking about something emotional or behavioral, what you want to do is if it's impairing day-to-day function, right? If it's impairing that your child doesn't want to go to school, or impairing their ability to do something that they could do before, or you see sudden changes, then you would want to seek more of the professional advice.
Yeah, I liked your point about talking to pediatricians and teachers or child care providers, because they also have a chance to see lots of kids. They're able to sort of help parents sort out how normal is this for a particular age? How typical is this behavior? Is it something to be worried about that should be looked at a little bit more deeply?
And is there a stigma involved sometimes in looking for professional advice? Do parents, in your experience with working with parents and working with children, is there a time where you think parents need to overcome a stigma or a fear of seeking out a professional?
Yeah, occasionally that's the case, right? And I think parents vary on how much they feel resistant to seeking help, because oftentimes as a parent, and oftentimes what we hear is my child doing something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Even when we see kids in our research, at our center, parents will say, "Did they do everything they were supposed to do?" Right? And what I often notice is that the parents often feel it's a reflection on them. And so I think that's part of it. So parents have to ask themselves, if it's something that bothers them, is that the stigma, right? Or is it really a worry about the stigma around their child?
And what about, we've talked about different publications and websites. What kind of role does television play? Karen, you've written 3 books, but you've also served as an advisor to Sesame Street. And my kids watch Sesame Street. They love Daniel Tiger. And I think they're really learning some important lessons about their emotions and their feelings. What kind of role does television play in development of a child?
So again, there's lots of different kinds of kid shows. I think Sesame Street is a good example of one that is really focused on trying to be educational. They have a nonprofit research group associated with them, the Sesame Workshop, that attempts to really look at what does the research suggest could be done with television and other media to really help development prosper. So it's an example where you see some wonderful work being done in terms of social emotional development and how to facilitate kids' early learning.
And a lot of people might not know that shows like Sesame Street are consulting with psychologists and professionals such as yourselves. Take us behind the scenes. How do professionals like yourself work with a television show like a Sesame Street to include the most relevant teachings in an educational show?
So they'll actually have consultation meetings where it usually occurs when they're interested in a particular topic. So in recent years, something that's sort of emerged that's been quite interesting to people is the development of early self-control. You might have heard people talk about executive functions. That has to do with children developing the skills to have self-control and be able to focus in school. So they were very interested in learning more about that research and what implications it would have for the kinds of shows they're producing. So they bring in a couple of experts and basically sit around and chat with you for the day.
So when they do come up with an interesting lesson, I know my daughters will sing different songs that they've heard about how to deal with being happy or how to deal with being angry. When we see our children doing something like that, how can we as parents reinforce those lessons that they're learning?
Well, I think kids like when you're familiar with what they're familiar with. So watching with them, right? Even learning those songs and using those songs at a time when you feel they need it or when you're driving in the car. And that reinforces what they're seeing in those positive messages.
And we have our first email of the night. Darlene writes, I'm a grandparent of 4. I work as a paraprofessional in an elementary school. We use positive behavior reward system in school, rewarding the good instead of pushing the bad. Do you feel this system would work in the home as well? Karen, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. In fact, there actually is quite a bit of research looking at just that factor. What's more powerful? Sort of giving instructions or ideas about positive behaviors and then reinforcing that versus focusing on punishment. And absolutely, the strength is in the positive. You really can't be too positive if you're focusing on specific efforts that children are making. So one of the things we caution parents about is being just globally positive or being focused on things like, oh, you're so pretty or you're so smart. That what you really want to do is be more specific and focus on the effort that they're putting into trying new things. That gives them sort of that confidence and support to keep working at their skill development.
So even if they try something new and they fail, it's that, hey, great effort, way to go.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. And that question was from a grandparent. Speaking as a parent, is it important for parents and grandparents to get on the same page when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, I would say so, and that's probably one of the places where there's often some conflict, right? And when, even going back to the beginning of the show when we talked about seeking advice, you get a lot of advice from family and people who have been through it, and it's hard to sort of wade through that. But being on the same page, whether it's grandparents to parents or both parents working together and supporting each other in whatever decisions they're making, that's always a challenge.
And one more question about where to get advice and where to get information. It's always changing. Advice to parents is always changing, 50s to 60s to now. Everything's developing. How do parents stay on top of the latest developments when it comes to behavioral or emotional support for their kids?
I mean, there are actually a lot of efforts to make the kind of research that happens in places like our center more available to parents, more available to teachers, to pediatricians, to keep that communication going. And I think it's actually much easier in today's world to get access to new findings than it was before we had so much technology. There's much quicker speed with which research gets transformed. I do think the shifting, the changes that have occurred in the sorts of advice that parents get generally do reflect the fact that we're just learning more about early development. We're mostly learning how much more is happening during the early years than we understood was happening, 20, 30 years ago.
True, yeah.
So I want to get into some more specific parenting topics right now. So I want to remind our viewers that our guests tonight are psychologists by training. So we're going to stick closely to what they're experts in. But if you have questions that we're not answering, feel free to give us a call. We'll answer as best as we can. If not, we'll try to point you in the right direction. Kristen, I want to start with you. A lot of the work you do is with emotional development and temperament in young children. When do parents really need to start paying attention to the emotional development of a child?
Right. Well, we can talk about a couple different things. One being sort of milestones and what would you expect kids to be able to express in terms of emotions and when. And, emotions develop over the first several years of life, first few years of life in particular. And so it's not like within a month, babies are going to be able to show all the different emotions that we think. And so over that first year, you start to see more of a variety of emotions that kids show. There's nothing really to be overly concerned about there unless you're not seeing any smiling, after a few months, or things that they're not expressing, emotions, regularly like most babies do.
What are some of the early emotions?
So the first emotion you're probably going to recognize would be the social smile or smiling really early, anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months, somewhere in that range. You start to see babies smiling in response to social stimulation, not those falling asleep smiles, right, that you often see in newborns, or those practice smiles, right, exactly. So that would be one of the first. You start to see frustration emerging 3 months, 4 months, where something, happens, whether the pacifier gets taken out of the mouth or something, something happens that that frustrates, if you will, if I can use that word, even with an infant, and you'll see anger. And you'll be able to differentiate that as a parent from the sadness or the hungry cry. You'll notice a difference. By the time we get into the second half of the first year of life, we start to see emotions like fear developing. And that's when you start to see your baby all of a sudden not wanting to go to grandma even, if they don't see grandma all the time. Sort of some of that sort of fear begins to emerge.
So when should we be aware of a delay in some of these emotions? I know parents are always trying to figure out, well, is there something wrong?
Sure.
Is my child developing the way they should be?
Sure.
So how do you identify that, and what do you tell parents to look out for?
Yeah, I would advise parents to not worry so much about whether their child's expressing their emotions as much as when they see the emotions. So, for example, I mentioned the social smile, and if you see your infant smiling in response to social interaction, that's a good thing, right? It's those social interactions, or becoming frustrated when they should become frustrated. I think when you would be need to begin to be concerned is when you're necessarily not seeing that social connection with the emotions. Emotions are inherently for communication before babies have words, really. And so if you're seeing those emotions when they're communicating the feeling state of the baby, then everything's fine.
And we have a phone call. Lindsay from Bellefonte. Lindsay, what's your question?
Hi, I was wondering, what if someone in your family has vastly different parenting style than you do, but you want your children to be together and to spend time together, but you need to explain to them, the differences between your parenting techniques and maybe someone else in the family?
Karen, do you want to start?
Yeah, that's always a tough situation. I think you already in your question, you have a little bit of an answer there, because you're talking about how can you explain to someone else in the family what your parenting philosophy is, or why you prefer to handle something in a particular way. And that's about all you can do, is to explain what your approach is and why you take it that way, and try to have a communication with them. But it is difficult, particularly around, we were talking a little bit earlier about being positive. So the balance that different parents might feel about positive versus the use of discipline, that can be tricky to negotiate. When children are younger, it's especially hard for them to understand they come to expect one particular kind of behavior. As your child gets older, it's something you can also talk with your child about that's Mimi's way, or and this is my way, to help them begin to at least understand when two people treat them very differently, that they can predict and understand when different people, when people will behave differently toward them. But your first idea of trying to talk with them and see if you can reach an understanding of your different philosophies, I think that's the first way to go.
Mm-hmm. Kristen, what about you? What about that tug of war between parenting styles?
Yeah, it's a hot button topic. But what I would add to that is something Karen said earlier, which is that we know so much more about child development and what are good parenting strategies and strategies that work than we did when our parents were raising us and their parents were raising them. And I think that might be one thing that you can bring up when you're having these discussions, is I've been reading a lot about this, and it is different than the way things used to be, and I'm more comfortable with it this way, and that might help with the conversation.
Good advice. If you're just joining us, I'm Bill Hallman, and this is Conversations Live. Our topic tonight is parenting. Our guests are Dr. Karen Bierman and Dr. Kristen Buss. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. I want to talk a little bit about transitions. Kristen and I were talking in the green room a little bit earlier about my personal life. I've moved around a lot. Our firstborn, I think she's lived in 4 different homes before she turns 5. They've been in and out of different schools and daycares. We've moved to different homes. That's a lot of change for a little kid. So what are some of the key transitions in a child's life that we as parents really need to pay attention to?
There's a couple big ones. One is, I'm going to let Kristen handle the first transition into daycare and childcare. I've studied a lot the first transition into kindergarten, preschool and kindergarten, and that's a really major transition. Sometimes we think about it from the academic standpoint, but it's a very big transition from the social and emotional standpoint as well, because children are moving for the first time into a large group organization where now there are a lot of rules. They need to be much more self-controlled, much more focused on being able to get along in a group. Some of the things we were talking about, emotions earlier, now they're really called on to manage their feelings in a new way. So it's a time when parenting can make a huge difference. The amount of support parents are able to do to help the child get used to those whole new set of demands.
I want to come back to kindergarten in a minute, but let's go back in time then. How about the preschool daycare transitions?
Sure, those are always major transitions, and even the moving transitions, as you mentioned. And what I find in my work is that certain kids, it just doesn't matter what you do, right? They're like dandelions; they'll grow anywhere. Yeah. But there are some kids who have more difficulty with transitions. And early in development, the kids are still learning how to do all of the things they're expected to be able to do when they transition to school. And so when those transitions are being made early, including a transition to the preschool, it can be a little overwhelming. And at the same time, kids are supposed to be expressing things like separation, anxiety from their parents, but it's really difficult when you're trying to drop them off at daycare or preschool and you have to go to work and your kids, having a difficult transition that particular day.
So is there a way for parents to prep them for it, to get them ready for that first day of daycare? I know it gets easier as the drop-offs continue to happen. They get more familiar with their teachers and their friends, but in the lead up to those new school or the first school days, what can parents do to try to help them ease into it a little bit more?
Right. Well, for the kinds of kids that I study, kids who are either anxious or at risk for being anxious, but even I would say for most kids, prepping them, telling them what's going to happen and why and when, and reminding them, and they might not have a good sense of time. When my boys were little, we used to talk about the number of sleeps before we got to go see grandma and grandpa or whatever, the event was. And that was easy for them to remember. But preparing them for what's about to happen can help. I think most daycare and preschool teachers would agree that not making that drop off longer and longer to actually just do it, get it done. The kids usually are okay once the parents are leaving. It's actually in the transition. So when we're talking about that separation in particular, if you've prepared them, I'll be right back. I'll be back at the end of the day, go play with your friends and then leave.
And what if it continues on, your child's having trouble adjusting? So the drop-offs aren't getting any easier. What happens then? Where should parents turn there? Is that an issue that they should be speaking or working closely with the daycare or the preschool, finding an advocate there?
Yes, I absolutely think they would. And Karen mentioned this early. The preschool teachers have tons more experience than most parents do, and have seen a variety of kids and know what works best in their center. And oftentimes, a lot of centers will have sort of strategies built in to help parents. But if you are having difficulty, I would say that would be the first place to go.
I would just add one thing that Kristen mentioned that I completely agree with is having a predictable routine. So young children, even older children, like to feel like they have some control over their life. And when things happen and they didn't know they were happening, or there is not a sort of a predictable way things happen, that's more anxiety provoking for them. So having a routine that you follow, one where they know what happens next, I think that's really helpful. I think the other big thing is for parents to watch their own emotions. So one thing Kristen mentioned earlier is parents can sometimes feel embarrassed by their child's behavior, or that somehow it reflects badly on them as a parent. And I think when you begin to feel that way, you want to make sure you're calming yourself down and separating it. This is really their emotional challenge. It only makes it worse if the parent's also getting upset during it. So to remind yourself to stay calm, and your job is to facilitate their capacity to make this easier over time.
And Kristen, I know you do a lot of work with anxiety, especially in parents' anxiety and how it could rub off on children. I want to talk about that in a minute, but we do have a phone call. David from Oil City. David, what's your question?
Yes, thanks for taking my call. I'm almost 40 years old, and growing up, my brothers and I were no stranger to the occasional spanking. Is this still an acceptable technique if used properly, or is this something that in today's times that you're really trying to move away from?
I would say most experts would say you can be a very effective parent without spanking, and there are a lot of strategies that you can use for discipline that don't involve spanking. So they would encourage you to look for alternatives. And the reason for that is couplefold. One, as you mentioned, if spanking's used appropriately. And probably there is no harm when it's used as in a non-emotional way as the consequence for an extreme behavior. But that's rarely what happens. What tends to happen is parents get caught up, and it's when they're angry that they spank. And so therein lies the danger that it becomes a sort of escalating, it escalates a situation with a child. And one thing we know that has driven a lot of the feeling that there are better alternatives is that children who tend to have a lot of problems with aggression themselves that carry it over to the peer group often do have parents who spank a lot at home. And so rather than the spanking teaching them not to hit, it's essentially taught them that's what you do when you're angry and you want to make somebody do what you say to do. So we would say there's lots of other ways to have consequences for children to have set limits and follow through that don't involve hitting them. And that's what I think the experts would recommend, is really looking at other strategies that you can use.
Kristen, any thoughts for David?
Yeah, what I would add to that, I agree with everything that Karen says, and there are some cultural differences in whether or not corporal punishment is used as a parenting strategy. So it gets, it's a difficult topic for us to talk about. But in general, disciplining children requires a toolbox of strategies, there's never one thing that works for every kid every single time. And I remember when my firstborn, timeouts never worked unless you would have to restrain him to make that work, which wasn't an option for us. So we had to come up with other strategies, other consequences for that behavior, because timeouts, what everybody else was telling us to use, wasn't working. So some variety of parenting strategies is usually the best approach.
Okay. David, thank you for your call. Karen, I promised we'd get back to transitioning into kindergarten, and new schools mean new kids, new sets of issues, behavioral, social, emotional. What do parents need to be paying attention to in those first few weeks of school when their kid's first starting in kindergarten?
So one of the things that we talked about already was a predictable routine. So that children, especially by the time they're starting kindergarten, when they're 5, they're able to understand ahead of time a plan. And when parents have a plan, they have a plan for how we're going to do morning, and then you'll go to school. Kindergartens often have orientation sessions where teachers will explain to children what the plan of the day is. That kind of anticipatory knowledge can be really helpful to children. Being able to talk to your parent about both what you're excited about in kindergarten, but also what you're worried about can be very helpful. Setting up a good sleep schedule turns out to be really important. So particularly around that transition from summer to get ready for school, and maintaining a good organization is really important to children. The other thing, if children have been in preschool, often they've already had a chance to get more comfortable with a group situation. But if they haven't had much social contact or much group interaction, parents should look for opportunities to make sure they've had an opportunity to be with a group of children, that they have a lot of social experience going into kindergarten.
So kindergarten's a time when they become a part of a larger group, and that means they're being introduced to a lot of different people, and we have an email that addresses that. It says, from Anonymous, my child is noticing and calling attention to racial differences. Is that okay? How do I address this? What would your advice be to that parent, Karen?
Yeah, so the caller doesn't say how old their child is, but yeah, children will notice even by age 3, they'll notice that people look different, and they'll talk about that. They'll sometimes talk about if they're matching or not matching. By kindergarten age, and as particular as children move into elementary school, they're going to be quite aware of that. They're going to be noticing how people look, who looks like them. And the important thing, it's fine to have conversations, to let them talk about what's the same and what's different, but to focus on then behaviors. You know, who do you enjoy spending time with?
Right.
The positive sort of, what are the characteristics of that are important in your relationships? You want to focus your discussion on that, so that they're really not thinking that this sort of superficial similarity has to organize who they become friends with or how they spend their time.
Any thoughts for the email question?
Yeah, I would just add or echo, or, you know, just a little bit more of what Karen was getting at is it's important to talk about it, because if you don't talk about what your kids are noticing, then they're going to think there's some reason they're not supposed to notice it, or there's something wrong with noticing it.
Excuse me. So also in kindergarten, as a parent whose child is getting ready to go to kindergarten, and I've talked to teachers, and you worry about how your child fits in academically, but it's, you know, my understanding that the academic and the social are pretty closely intertwined in kindergarten. How much should we be paying attention as parents to the academics of kindergarten?
So that is a way in which school has really changed pretty strikingly in the last 15 years. So people sometimes say kindergarten is now the new first grade, and in a sense that is really true, that now most schools are hoping children will begin to read in kindergarten, and that did not used to be the case. And part of that is because so many children in the U.S. now go to preschool. So they're beginning to learn pre-reading skills and pre-math skills in preschool. It is a good idea to be watching out for your child's cognitive development. You know, are they learning colors, numbers, letters? Are they showing an interest in reading? Those things are important to support as a parent. Sometimes parents worry, well, I don't want to focus on that because I want to make sure they have playtime. And as you said, you can really do both. You can play number and letter games with your child, right? We shouldn't be thinking of them as one thing or the other. The more that children learn, the more their language skills develop, their cognitive skills develop. Generally, it helps them socially. The more experience they have with other children, the more support they have for social emotional development, enhances their focus and their learning skills. So really it's kind of focusing on both and helping them support each other.
And school age, kids will be introduced to new people, new technologies, and we have another email that addresses that. And I don't know what you'll have to add on this, but maybe we can get an answer for Cindy. She writes, when is it too soon for kids to use smartphones or tablets? Is there any guidance you would be able to give to Cindy? Kristen?
Well, I would add that it's an ever-changing landscape, even faster than anything that we've talked about. There was actually just a study that was done in the UK showing that perhaps our guidelines for the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for the use of tablets in infants might even be outdated already, because cell phones and tablets are so they're everywhere.
And that was the no screen time
before 2.
Before 2, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so there might be some changes on the horizon. So it's one of those things where know your source and maybe the date of your source when you go to look up this information. So in terms of tablet use, you just need to use some common sense in terms of what it is that they're looking at, what it is they're playing. Are you using it instead of something else? Those are all things that we should try to avoid. As far as when kids should have their own smartphones, I mean, I do think right now, I don't know what the research is telling us, but it seems like that middle school transition seems to be very common. Whether that's supported by the research or not, that's a bit beyond what my knowledge base is.
I would agree with you, though, that it's hard for the research to keep up with the changing in technology. And so I'd second your common sense. I think the market for video games and educational games, a parent can't trust just because it's marketed as an educational game or a game for children that it's something good for them to be doing. So I would just say be focused and be thoughtful about what you're seeing. Is it something that your child seems to be really learning with, and are you able to interact with your child around it? Or does it seem to be something that is really isolating them and leading to sort of repetitive behavior that's not providing an opportunity for development?
So maybe not such a, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can.
No, so
finish
maybe
that
not
thought.
such a good idea to give them a tablet and give them free reign on YouTube, but
Right.
maybe have a more organized structure where there are a few apps perhaps that are educational that you can work with them in maybe pronouncing words or something like that.
Absolutely. I did want to add, too, that there are a handful of studies out, and one that came out of a collaboration I recently did about parents' use of cell phones in front of their infants. So these were infants between 4 months and 24 months of age in our study, where we had the moms and the babies playing, and then we brought in, or mom had a cell phone, and we sort of signaled her to use it. And they were having this interaction, and then mom starts to basically ignore the child. We tell her to be on her cell phone, and we see marked behavioral differences in the kids. And there were a handful of other studies that have shown that. So parents also need to be mindful, I think, of their use of technology around their children and making sure that it's not, taking time away from their kids.
I think my wife and I have been very sensitive to that. We both have our cell phones. We both have emails from work coming in, and we sometimes kind of guilt each other to say, "Hey, put the
Right.
cell phone down. We're with the family now," and our kids know that that's daddy's cell phone, that's mommy's cell phone, and that kind of brings it into perspective of how much of these devices are out and in front of your children.
Right.
And it kind of makes you think twice about maybe you should put them up on the counter when you get home from work and ignore those emails for a few minutes. And just to be clear, when the studies talk about screen time, does that also mean television?
Yes, usually.
When Kristen was talking about the American Academy of Pediatrics, they lumped them all together, but it's not clear that screen time is screen time is screen time. Now I think people are finding, well, it really depends on what it is that you're watching. So, for example, letting your toddler watch Sesame Street might be useful exposure. Having the TV on in the background of, we're talking about Judge Judy, probably not. So I think it's a period of time where we're still trying to understand, and parents basically, I would say, use common sense.
Stick to PBS, right? Kristen, I promised that we'd get back to some of the issues that you work with, and I found your work with overparenting to be very interesting. Are we worried about our kids too much? Can we worry too much?
Yes, we absolutely can. I think one of the things that we find in our work, where kids generally live in safe places and are not really at risk for dangers in their environment, like a place like State College, for example. If their child's already sort of shy and withdrawn and fearful, when parents do too much for their kids, when parents protect their kids from those things that might make them nervous, like spending too much time at drop-off at daycare, or not insisting that their child go across the street to the neighbor's house and play because they're a little afraid of it. When they don't gently encourage their kids to do those things, it actually makes them more anxious. So taking over for your kid, for certain kids, that can create more problems.
So if a parent finds out that they are overparenting, if they're a little bit too hands-on and they're hovering a little too much, how can a parent break out of that cycle. That strikes me as something that would be very difficult to do.
Right. It would be difficult to sort of teach yourself to do it. There are some interventions for children who are at risk for anxiety or who are actually anxious. There are some parent interventions that focus on teaching the parents not to step in too quickly, and basically teaching the parents how much their kids can do on their own. Right. So there's a lot of practice around that. Aside from that, I think you just need to take a moment, take a deep breath. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? Put your own emotions in check. One of the things Karen mentioned earlier is that when parents get emotionally, they get reactive about the situation. It becomes more about them than it does their child. We have there's another set of research that shows that when parents are focused on their own emotions, it's like the overparenting. It's about their goals rather than their child's goals.
And you've done a lot of work with fear and fearful temperaments. Fear is a natural response, especially when you're dealing with something new. How can a parent tell if what their child is experiencing is normal fear as opposed to something that's beyond that?
Right, something we should worry about. One thing would be in comparison, if it's an experience where they're seeing other kids in that setting, do they notice that their kid, their child is very similar to the other kids or is quite different from the other kids? If they only see it in certain situations, it's usually okay. There are some kids who are just going to be their personality. They're just more wary. They're just more fearful. And anytime that they experience something new, they're going to be a little bit more cautious. And that's okay. Where we start to worry is if it influences how they're sleeping, if it influences whether they want to go to school at all. They start complaining about stomach aches and headaches to avoid doing new things when it starts to really impair sort of their day-to-day experiences, then parents should start paying more attention.
And if you're just joining us, I'm Bill Hallman, and this is Conversations Live. Our topic tonight is parenting. Our guests are Dr. Karen Bierman and Dr. Kristen Buss. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer, email us. Our address is connect@wpsu.org, and we have a new email in right now. An anonymous writer writes, "What is your opinion on saying something positive before correcting your child? Example, you did a good job cleaning your room, but you missed some toys under your bed. I know it works for me when my anxiety gets high and I miss something. I have done this with pre-K kids and it usually worked." Karen, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit earlier about how helpful it is for children to get positive feedback, to get both, there's a strategy called pre-correction, where even before they've done something wrong, you say, I'm hoping when I look under your bed, I'm going to see you got the toys there too. That can be very helpful. Just as you said, the commenting on the things that are really good, and then something that still needs attention, it balances. It gives them that positive support for where they've put in good effort, but also identifies another area for them to work on. So I think that balance is very useful. It's easy for children when they're learning new things to not get it all right. That's a very typical reaction. And so a parent wants to be careful not to criticize in a way that really shuts down that effort and that striving toward mastery. And so you have a strategy that's sort of balancing the positive support and then the identification. We had talked before, we were talking about how a parent can get over-involved when they have a shy child, but there's also been research done with parents who get over-involved when they have a misbehaving child. So, for example, there was a study done with children who had ADHD and tended to have difficulty, get overexcited in social situations. And the parents who got embarrassed and yelled more at their child, that child actually was more disliked by playmates than similarly behaved child whose parents were more chill and focusing on the skills, the positive things that the child could do. So I think you're right to be kind of aware of the negative impact criticism can have. Children need direction and they need redirection, but there are more positive ways of framing that in a way that, you know, encourages them to make a positive choice and give it another try.
Is there a time when children will start to realize that their parent is hovering a little bit too much, or that they're overprotective, or they're a little bit too involved, and kind of push back on that?
Yeah, I think kids know that. They might show that in terms of their behavior. When they're younger, they might always turn to their parent. They might always reference their parent anytime that they're in a new situation. One of the things you and I had talked about at one point, now I'd like to repeat it here, is that when parents take over and protect their kids from things that they may not need to really be protected from, it teaches the child a couple things. One, maybe I can't handle this on my own. And two, this is probably something I should be afraid of. And so what that does is it reinforces those feelings that the child already has. And then when they feel those things again, they're going to look to the parent, what should I do? Because over time, if it happens over and over again, they've learned that their parent is going to be there for them. As they get older, I imagine they're able to think about it a lot more complexly than just, looking back at their parent and thinking about it and say, hey, I think my parents always do stuff for me and I don't want that anymore.
And we have another caller, Shara, I'm sorry if I don't get your name right. Shara from Clearfield. What's your question?
It's Shara.
Okay, Shara, sorry about that. Go ahead.
No problem. We were actually told by the school district. My son has ADHD, hyperactivity, and we don't know where to go to get a second opinion, like a doctor. Could you help me?
So every county has county mental health services. You can contact them and ask them how to get an evaluation, just exactly what you told us you're looking for. You would like a second evaluation around your, that the school has suggested your child has hyperactivity or ADHD, and you'd like a second opinion. Do they have referrals? They both can do that themselves, and they'll also have a list of psychologists who are in the area who also could do that privately for you. Your pediatrician also could give you the same kind of referrals. So those would be my suggestions for you.
Kristen, any input for Shara?
That would be, I was going to add pediatricians, at least if just somebody you trust to get a referral from.
Shara, thank you for your phone call. I'm told we have an email. I'd like to be able to see it if the control room could put that up for me. Maria writes, my 10-year-old has been asking questions about what she hears on the news. Yeah. How do I talk to my kids about politics? That's an interesting question. How do you talk to your kid about what you see on the news?
Yeah, it's really important. This is a bit like with the question we had about when children notice race. They notice these things around them, and I think it's really important to be sure that you're creating an open line of communication. The trick is you don't want to get ahead of them. You want to sort of understand what is it on the news that interests them? What is it that they were curious about, or they wanted to know more about, or they were upset about, or they were concerned about, so that you understand how did they understand the information that they saw or heard, and then you want to respond to that. Sometimes it's easy as a parent because we know so much more about politics that we think we understand, and give an explanation that doesn't really address the issue as they understood it. But the more you can ask them questions, what did they hear, what did they think about that, as well as them providing information at a level that matches sort of their level of understanding.
And go ahead, Kristen.
Well, I would just add really quickly too, they're going to be exposed to those things if the TV's on in the house. But in general, using the common sense about trying to limit, especially if something has happened that you don't want them to see, depending on the age of the kid. What is it that they're exposed to, and try to control that as much as you can. But if you can't, then I think Karen's advice is perfect.
That was a good email. We'll go from politics to bullying now. It seems like a natural transition. There was a recent survey from the University of Michigan, and it polled adults about their top health concerns for their children, and 61% of respondents responded that bullying and cyberbullying, it was the top response, was their top health concern for their child. When I talked to parents before the show, aggression questions seem to come up a lot. To me, it's complicated. Siblings can kind of beat on each other a little bit, but when do we know when it rises from at home, two kids picking on each other, to something more serious than that?
So are you asking, how do you know if your child is bullying, or?
No, I would say, I would say, how would you identify if your child is displaying aggressive behavior? Mm-hmm. How do you identify that aggressive behavior is a little more troubling than just normal boys will be boys behavior, if you will?
So this is a case where finding out about behavior at school is really helpful. Young children, there's a fair amount of physical rough and tough, taking somebody's toys. It's sort of the preschool teachers deal with that all day, and they're teaching at that level. It's very much about teaching, sharing, and asking, and how you can manage conflicts using words. As children enter school, there is an expectation that they're coming into school with a lot of those skills, but in reality, social relationships are pretty complicated. They get more complicated as children get into higher elementary levels, and really quite complicated by middle school and high school. And often at home, you're not going to see the behavior that is happening at school. You're not going to know how well is your child establishing friendships and able to manage conflicts. And the way to get that information is really to talk with teachers and get a better understanding of how things are going at home. Schools will let you know if they think your child is showing aggressive behavior, having trouble following rules at school. And then the big challenge is to figure out as a parent, how can you work effectively with school to help your child learn more self-control and learn to manage strong feelings.
Are there particular types of classroom dynamics that could lead to more aggressive behavior in children?
So when you talk about bullying is a particular classroom dynamic that is much more complicated than just, like, we sometimes think, oh, there's a mean kid and they bully. There are children who have problems with aggressive behavior, but very often bullying, especially if you're talking about later elementary, middle school, high school, is a more social event. It emerges through individuals that want to have social dominance, and it works with bystanders sort of also responding to the bullying. And so those kinds of events need to be managed at the school as well as things you can do as a parent at home. You really want to work on creating a positive social climate that facilitates the development of skills and that sort of breaks up those social cliques that facilitate the survival of bullying and the escalation of bullying.
Kristen, what about confrontations at school? If a child is anxious or fearful about a confrontation at school, how we can, as parents, talk to our children about that before they go to the classroom?
Right,
or how can we head that off, or give them the tools to speak to that classmate who they might be intimidated by? Right.
I mean, anxious children or children at risk for anxiety really do have, especially if it's social anxiety, really have difficulty for different reasons with these social skills. They aren't necessarily more often the victims of this kind of behavior, but that can be the case. They tend, socially withdrawn kids, so they're sort of removed themselves from the peers, are at risk for sort of missing out on practice with these social skills. So I think one of the things that parents can do if they think that their child will be too anxious to get themselves into those social groups and even just do the classroom activities with their classmates, is talk to the teacher about ways to, introduce their kid and give and reinforce those behaviors for their kids.
It also helps a lot to have a friend in class. So it's another thing parents can do, even though they're not there during the school day.
Right.
They can help to support friendships with classmates at home through having kids over, helping their child get into activities where they would have more social contact. So you're trying to strengthen the social support that's there in the social network, strengthen the social skills, as well as then if you are concerned about a bullying dynamic at school, talking with a teacher about those concerns.
And we're running short on time. We have about 1 minute left. I want to give you a chance to speak to our viewers out there, any parents that may be watching or who may watch this online later. What are some final takeaways you'd like them to take from this conversation tonight? Karen, we'll start with you.
So we've been talking a lot about the hardships of parenting and the tough things, and I think, at the core, parenting is just a wonderful life experience. And I guess my advice would be, even as you're dealing with the struggles your child is having, not to forget to find that time to really connect with them every day and strengthen that communication relationship.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Live in the moment with your kids and enjoy all the little things, because it goes really fast.
I'd like to thank tonight's guests, Dr. Karen Bierman, the director of the Child Studies Center at Penn State, and Dr. Kristen Buss, a professor of psychology and human development and family studies at Penn State. I'm Bill Hallman. For all of us here at WPSU, thank you for joining us. Good night. Thank you so much for being here, ladies.